Hi, this is Mrs. Ness-Deden, and today we are learning about nutrient cycles. Over the last week or so, we have been talking about the molecules of life that are made up of these Schnapps elements: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Today we're going to talk about how these elements, which we also refer to as nutrients, move through ecosystems and how living things take them in the first place. We call this movement of elements through ecosystems biogeochemical cycles. These are when elements pass from one organism to another and among other parts of the biosphere through closed loops. So if you look at this word for a minute, biogeochemical cycle looks like a really big fancy word, right? Well, this first part, bio, you know that means life, right? So these elements are moving through living things from one organism to another. The geo part of that word refers to Earth. When it says among parts of the biosphere, that refers to things like the soil and rocks. So elements are also found in there. And the third part of this word, chemical, refers to the fact that these elements go through chemical changes as they go through these cycles. So you'll see all of that happening as we start talking more about how these cycles work. Nutrients and energy both flow through ecosystems. We talked about energy flow earlier in the trimester, and they're similar because they pass up the food chain through different trophic levels. But remember, energy only flows in one direction and it gets used up as you go. Nutrients are not like that. These atoms get recycled around and around and are used over and over to build living things. Here's one of these cycles that you are very familiar with. You've learned about the water cycle for a long time, right? You've studied how rain can fall as precipitation. It gets taken up and used by living things. Plants can evaporate out their leaves through transpiration. Water can evaporate off of rivers and streams, and it can condense in the air. So all of those different things are happening in the water cycle as water moves around and around through the cycle. A couple of the words on this diagram that may not be as familiar to you. Percolation really just refers to runoff or groundwater as it goes from the land back into the water. And transpiration is the evaporation that happens out of the leaves of plants. So you can see from looking at the water cycle, something that's called the conservation of mass. The water never disappears. It's just recycled and reused over and over. The same is true of all of the Schnapps elements. All these different atoms are recycled through ecosystems. And today we're particularly going to spend some time taking a look at the carbon cycle and how carbon is recycled, since carbon is kind of that central atom that's the major building block of all the molecules of life that we've been talking about. You're going to do a short reading now about the carbon cycle and then answer a few questions on it. And then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about how this cycle works. So as you did your reading, did you take some time to actually read this diagram? Reading diagrams is really, really important in science. There's a lot of information in here. So I'm actually going to take a couple minutes and read through part of what you just read. But as I do it, I want you to look at this diagram on your screen and try and follow as I talk about different parts of this cycle and as different types of carbon are mentioned. See if you can find where they are in this diagram. So listen for just a minute. Carbon is a major component of all organic compounds, including carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. In fact, carbon is such a key ingredient of living tissue and ecosystems that life on Earth is often described as carbon-based life. Carbon, in the form of calcium carbonate, is an important component of many different kinds of animal skeletons and is also found in several kinds of rocks. Carbon and oxygen form carbon dioxide gas, which is an important component of the atmosphere and is dissolved in oceans. Some carbon-containing compounds that were once part of ancient forests have been buried and transformed by geological processes into coal. The bodies of marine organisms containing carbon have been transformed into oil or natural gas. Coal, oil, and natural gas are often referred to as fossil fuels because they are essentially fossilized carbon. Major reservoirs of carbon in the biosphere include the atmosphere, oceans, rocks, fossil fuels, and forests. Figure 317, which you are looking at right now, shows how carbon moves through the biosphere. Carbon dioxide is continuously exchanged between the atmosphere and oceans through chemical and physical processes. Plants take in carbon dioxide during photosynthesis and use the carbon to build carbohydrates. Carbohydrates then pass through food webs to consumers. Many animals, both on land and in the sea, combine carbon with calcium and oxygen as the animals build skeletons of calcium carbonate. Organisms release carbon in the form of carbon dioxide gas by respiration. Also, when organisms die, decomposers break down their bodies, releasing carbon to the environment. Geological forces can turn accumulated carbon into carbon-containing rocks or fossil fuels. Carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere by volcanic activity or by human activities such as the burning of fossil fuels and the clearing and burning of forests. So hopefully you were able to follow some of those parts of this cycle as I talked through them. Let's look a little more closely at how this cycle works. So here is another diagram showing the same cycle. You'll see a lot of the same pieces in here that you just looked at. Often when I think about the carbon cycle, the easiest way is to kind of look at it as a short version of the cycle and a longer version. There's part of this that is happening continuously and another part that takes a lot longer. So here's the short cycle. There's always carbon in the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. Plants take that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and use it for photosynthesis. And from there, once the plants have taken that carbon dioxide and turned it into glucose, into C6H12O6, that's one of those carbohydrates that we've been studying, then that carbohydrate then passes up through the food chain. We get our carbohydrates or get our carbon through some of the things that we eat, like carbohydrates. And then as we break down our food, animals and other things release that carbon back into the atmosphere through respiration. We breathe out carbon dioxide and then it's back up here in the air. So this is kind of the short, quick version of the carbon cycle that's happening constantly all the time. There's also kind of a longer cycle that involves these things called carbon reservoirs. A reservoir is kind of a place that carbon can be stored for long periods of time. So all that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can also get dissolved into the ocean. If you remember, they talked about that a little bit in the video Lethal Seas and how that's changing the chemistry of the oceans. Oceans store carbon for a long, long time. Some of the carbon can also get turned into rocks through that process of sedimentation, or some of the living things that die can be turned into fossil fuels. Those are also places that carbon can be stored for a really long time. Eventually, it is still released back into the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels or geological activity or other processes like that. But that cycle takes a much, much longer time. Tomorrow, you're going to be doing a project where you are going to be looking a little more at this carbon cycle. So make sure that you took some notes on today's video. If you didn't, go back and watch this again and take some notes because you're going to need those as we keep moving forward. Have a great day.